In the summer of 1832, the American painter George Catlin traveled far up the Missouri River and spent time living among the Mandan, a nation of farmers and traders who lived in round earthen lodges. Catlin was captivated by them, and he came away convinced that the Mandan were unlike any other people he had met in the West. He noted that some had lighter skin, gray or hazel eyes, and hair in shades of brown. He watched them cross the river in round boats of buffalo hide, stretched over willow, boats that looked, to his eye, almost exactly like the coracles of Wales. And he reached a startling conclusion, which he laid out in his famous book of 1841. The Mandan, he believed, were not purely native at all. They were, he argued, the descendants of Welshmen, the children of a colony led to America before Columbus by a Welsh prince named Madoc. It became one of the most famous ideas on the American frontier, and only a few years after Catlin painted them, the Mandan were struck by a catastrophe that nearly wiped them from the earth. So were the Mandan really the lost children of a Welsh prince? And why did so many people so badly want them to be? To follow that question honestly, we have to start with what Catlin actually saw, and with the old legend he reached for to explain it. George Catlin was a serious observer, a painter who devoted years of his life to traveling among the native nations of the West and recording their faces, their dress, and their ways in hundreds of paintings, at a time when he rightly feared that much of that world was about to be destroyed. His portraits of the Mandan are precious precisely because of what happened to them soon after. He built a great traveling gallery of these paintings and showed it across America and Europe. And for many people in the East and abroad, Catlin's images were the Mandan, the only window they would ever have onto a nation most of them would never meet. That gave his opinions enormous reach, and it meant that when Catlin declared the Mandan to be Welsh, a great many people simply believed it. So when Catlin says he was struck by the Mandan, it is worth taking seriously as an honest impression, while remembering that an honest impression from a sympathetic painter is still not the same thing as evidence. He found them a strikingly handsome and distinctive people. He noted their large, well-planned towns of domed earth lodges above the river. He was fascinated by their round hide boats, which they used to ferry people and goods across the wide Missouri, and which really do resemble the coracle, the small round boat that has been used on the rivers of Wales since ancient times. And he believed he saw, among the Mandan, more variety of complexion and hair and eye color than he expected, including individuals who looked to him part European. For Catlin, all of this pointed one way. He connected what he saw to a story that had been floating around the English-speaking world for centuries, the legend of Prince Madoc. The legend runs like this. In the 12th century, in the 1100s, a Welsh prince named Madoc, the son of a king of Gwynedd, is said to have sailed west across the Atlantic to escape the wars over his father's throne and to have landed somewhere in America. According to the tale, he founded a colony, returned to Wales for more settlers, sailed west a second time, and was never heard from again, leaving behind a group of Welsh colonists who vanished into the interior of the continent. Over the centuries that followed, the idea grew that these lost Welshmen had survived by blending with a native people, producing a tribe of Welsh-speaking, lighter-skinned Indians somewhere out in the unexplored West. For generation after generation, explorers and traders on the American frontier went looking for these Welsh Indians, and every so often someone claimed to have found a tribe whose language sounded a little like Welsh, or who seemed a little fair. The Mandan, remote, distinctive, and boat-building, were the most famous candidate of all, and Catlin gave the theory its most influential voice. And there is a detail worth knowing because it explains a great deal about why the story was pushed so hard. In the days of Queen Elizabeth I, when England was competing with Spain for claims to the New World, English writers found the Madoc legend extremely useful, because if a British prince had reached America in the 1100s, then Britain could claim to have discovered it before Spain. A medieval Welsh tale became a piece of political propaganda for an empire. Elizabethan writers and advisors, including scholars close to the crown, promoted the Madoc voyage in print precisely because a prior British discovery of America strengthened England's hand against Spanish claims. Once a story has been useful to a throne, it develops a life of its own, repeated in book after book until it feels like settled fact simply because everyone has heard it. That is part of the current that carried the story all the way to the banks of the Missouri. And it is exactly where an honest documentary has to stop admiring the romance and start checking the facts. If you enjoy slow documentaries that take a beloved historical legend seriously enough to actually test it, rather than just repeating it, consider subscribing, because it genuinely helps these longer videos reach the people who like them. Because when you examine the Welsh Indian theory piece by piece, every single leg of it gives way. Start with Madoc himself, because the whole structure rests on him. Is there any solid historical evidence that a Welsh prince named Madoc sailed to America in the 1100s? The answer is no. There is no contemporary record of such a voyage. nothing written at the time it supposedly happened. The story of Madoc as an ocean voyager does not appear in a developed form until centuries later, and it flowers most fully in exactly the Elizabethan period when it was politically convenient, which is a serious warning sign. Most historians regard the transatlantic Madoc as legend rather than history, a tale that grew in the telling and was then put to use, not a documented event. If the founding voyage itself is almost certainly a myth, the lost Welsh colonists who were supposed to become the Mandan never existed to begin with. Then take the language, because language is where a claim like this lives or dies. If the Mandan were partly Welsh, some trace of the Welsh language should survive among them, and generations of Welsh Indian hunters swore they heard it. But when the Mandan language is actually studied, it is clearly a Siouan language, part of a large and well-understood family of native languages of the Americas, related to the tongues of other plains and Midwestern nations. It is not related to Welsh, which is a Celtic language from an entirely different family on the other side of the world. The occasional claim that a Mandan word sounded like a Welsh one never held up to real linguistic comparison. The languages are simply not related, and here the story hands us its own quiet debunk, delivered long before modern linguistics. In the 1790s, a young Welshman named John Evans, who fervently believed in the Welsh Indians, actually made the difficult journey up the Missouri to find them, traveling all the way to the Mandan villages and living among them expressly to prove the connection and hear his own language spoken back to him. He was as motivated a believer as anyone could be. And after his time with the Mandan, Evans reported honestly that they were not Welsh, that he had found no Welsh speakers and no evidence of a Welsh origin at all. One of the theory's own true believers went to the source and came back to say it was not so, more than 40 years before Catlin revived it. Next, the boats. The round-hide boat that so impressed Catlin, often called a bull boat, is real and was genuinely used by the Mandan, but it was not unique to them and it did not come from Wales. Bull boats made of hide stretched over a bent wood frame were used by a number of peoples along the Missouri and across the plains, including the Mandan's neighbors, and they are a sensible, independent solution to the same problem the coracle solves: how to make a light boat where big trees for dugouts are scarce. Similar shapes appear because similar needs and materials produce similar answers, not because someone carried a Welsh design across the ocean. And finally, the lighter features. Human beings vary, and a range of complexions, hair, and eye colors can appear in any population. Whatever variety Catlin saw among the Mandan falls within the normal range of human appearance, and by his time, there had also been decades of contact and some intermarriage along the fur trade routes of the Missouri. None of it requires, or points to, a medieval Welsh colony. Every leg of the theory, the prints, the language, the boats, the faces, gives way when you lean on it. And this is where the story turns from a harmless curiosity into something that deserves a firmer correction, because the Welsh Indian theory did not describe the Mandan. It erased them. This is the point where we have to set the myth down and speak plainly about who the Mandan actually were, because the reality is far more impressive than the legend. The Mandan were one of the great peoples of the northern plains, skilled farmers who raised corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers in the rich bottomlands of the Missouri, and who lived not in teepees but in large permanent towns of substantial earth lodges. Their villages were among the most important trade centers on the northern plains, hubs where nations from across the region came to exchange goods, so that Mandan towns functioned as a kind of great marketplace of the interior. They had a rich and complex ceremonial life, including a great annual ceremony, the Okipa, a days-long sacred observance of creation and renewal that Catlin himself witnessed and painted, and that involved acts of endurance and sacrifice at the heart of Mandan religious life. Their earth lodges were engineering in their own right, large round homes framed with heavy timber and covered in packed earth, cool in summer and warm through the brutal plains. Winter, built and owned largely by the women of the community. When the explorers Lewis and Clark came up the Missouri at the start of the 1800s, they chose to spend the winter near the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, relying on their hospitality and their knowledge to survive, and it was there that they were joined by the interpreter whose Shoshone wife, Sacagawea, would become famous. The Mandan, in other words, were not a mystery to be explained by a Welsh prince. They were a sophisticated, formidable, deeply rooted native nation, and to hand their towns and their art and their achievements to imaginary Welshmen is to do exactly what the lost race myths always did, to look at something remarkable made by native people and insist that someone else must really be behind it. And then comes the part that must be told with the greatest care, because it is the reason the Mandan came to seem, to outsiders, like a vanished people. Only a few years after Catlin painted them, in the year 1837, a steamboat carried smallpox up the Missouri River, and the disease reached the Mandan towns. The Mandan had little immunity, and the epidemic that followed was catastrophic beyond words. In a matter of weeks, the great majority of the Mandan people died, and a nation that had numbered in the thousands was reduced to a small remnant of survivors, perhaps only 100 or so. It was one of the most devastating epidemics in the recorded history of the Northern Plains, and it fell upon the Mandan with terrible speed. This was not a mysterious fading away of a lost white tribe, the way the romantic version of the story sometimes suggests. It was a real and specific human catastrophe, a disease brought upriver, striking a people who had no defense against it, and it should be remembered as the tragedy it was, and not folded into a legend. And here the honest story diverges sharply from the myth, because the Mandan did not vanish. The survivors endured. In the years that followed, they drew together with their old neighbors and allies, the Hidatsa and the Arikara, and the three peoples eventually built a shared community and a common future on the upper Missouri. Today, the Mandan people continue as part of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, the three affiliated tribes, at the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. They are still here, carrying their history and their identity forward, working to keep the Mandan language alive as elders and teachers pass it to a new generation, and telling their own story in their own voice. A people who were nearly destroyed within a single lifetime not only survived but reorganized, endured more than a century of further hardship, including the loss of much of their best land to a dam and a reservoir in the 20th century, and remain a nation today. That endurance, and not a fairy tale about a Welsh prince, is the real epic of the Mandan. The obvious question is the honest one to end on. If the Welsh theory fails at every point, why did it grip so many people so hard? And the answer says more about the tellers than about the Mandan. A distinctive native nation that was then struck down by disease made a perfect blank screen onto which outsiders could project a flattering European origin, and the Madoc legend gave them a ready-made story to do it with. The eagerness to believe was never really about the Mandan at all. None of the honest questions here are unanswered. We do not have every detail of Mandan history before contact, and human variation in appearance is never perfectly explained, but we can separate the solid ground from the myth. Here is what nobody who checks seriously disputes. George Catlin, in his book of 1841, gave his famous voice to an old idea, arguing that the Mandan were descendants of the Welsh prince Madoc. There is no historical evidence that Madoc sailed to America, and the developed legend traces to much later times when it served political ends. The Mandan language is Siouan and is not related to Welsh. The bullboat is an independent native technology used by several Missouri River peoples. In 1837, a smallpox epidemic carried up the river by a steamboat devastated the Mandan, reducing a nation of thousands to a small remnant of survivors. And the Mandan survive today as part of the three affiliated tribes at Fort Berthold. Those are the solid stones. Here is where the questions begin, and they are not really about whales. We do not know every reason the Mandan looked distinctive to Catlin, beyond ordinary human variation and the contact of the fur trade era. We do not know exactly why this particular legend, out of all the tall tales of the frontier, took such deep root. But we do know it was not because a Welsh prince founded a tribe on the Missouri. Visit the Mandan homeland today and you will find no lost Welsh colony, but you will find the three affiliated tribes, the living descendants of the people Catlin painted, keeping a history that is entirely their own. The Earth Lodge towns, the farms, the trade, the ceremonies, and the survival through catastrophe were all Mandan and never Welsh. History is rarely settled by a single painter or a single legend, and some myths persist because they flatter the people who tell them rather than the people they are told about. It is assembled slowly, one checked record, one honest language study, one respected living nation at a time, and sometimes the most important correction is to give a real people back their own history and their own achievements. The Welsh Indians theory sits in that space. The Mandan real, the Welsh prince a legend, the survivors still here. The Mandan were real, the prince was a myth. The people endure to this day. Thank you for sorting the history from the legend with me. If you would like more of these, the kind that return a native achievement to the people who actually made it, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what the next one does. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When outsiders look at a remarkable people and insist that the real story must belong to someone from across the ocean, what are they really trying to claim, and what and who are they trying not to see?